Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons difficulty check versus Modiphius's 2d20 difficulty check. And today we're going to talk about what's worse about the Modiphius 2d20 difficulty check than the Dungeons and Dragons difficulty check. Now, I did an entire video describing everything that was better. Let's get into what's worse. Complexity. Oh my gosh. When I read this, when you read this for the first time, it makes absolutely no sense, right? So it's, first of all, you can have, so what's the target number? The target number is, in Modiphius, is your attribute plus your discipline, okay? But it wasn't super clear that these were added together, right? You could understand it that when you read it, you could absolutely understand it that you're rolling 3d20, right? And you are going to that you're rolling these 3d20, right? And you're looking for numbers that are below both the attribute and the discipline, not added together, right? So you could definitely misunderstand it that way, and you really don't understand it until you dig into it, and you could play that way for weeks, right? Like, before somebody in your group figured it out. It is incredibly complex, right? Like really, really complex. So the complexity is dramatically higher than the Dungeons and Dragons difficulty check, right? Now, I will give points here. I just do want to remember, Dungeons and Dragons does have some terrible, terrible problems with this difficulty check. They absolutely should have abandoned that, 14, and that means it's a +2. They should just got rid of the 14. It's so bad. It's incredibly destructive. It's arbitrarily confusing, but this is worse on the 2d20 Modiphius side, okay? So the complexity is just outrageous. It is so ridiculously high. Like, it's attribute plus your discipline. They're added. When you roll 3d20, you're looking for numbers below the two added numbers, but you're also looking for a number below the discipline. And then, if a focus is in the mix, right? And then it's outrageously complicated, okay? And then, so you have your target number is your attribute plus your discipline added together, and then and that's actually not even a target, right? The target is the number of successes you need, which can be 0. Now, why would you need a zero target, 0 success roll, right? Wouldn't you, in Dungeons and Dragons, you would just skip that roll, right? Well, the reason you need it is this momentum mechanic within the 2d20 Modiphius system is a direct reward to the player. It replaces inspiration, right? In many ways, right? And boons and things like, that you would see and bennies, which a lot of people add into a lot of other tabletop role-playing games. So so you're going for a certain number of successes, and then you really want to get way more than your needed successes. And we didn't even get into like how threat introduces, and then so just the number of, the idea that you could have 0 success, that you could be making a series, a target of 0 successes. When you read it, it's ridiculously ununderstandable, right? It's just extremely complicated. The other issue is every time you make a roll, you have to figure out what is the attribute, what is the discipline. And that's more complicated than Dungeons and Dragons, because in Dungeons and Dragons, they're linked, right? And so you might be able to memorize them. And many people have, right? I think I have most of them memorized. right? And then, but beyond that, you are, so they're freewheeling and they can go in any direction, so you can't even memorize them, right? And then there's all these focuses, so the player has to, like, the dungeon master has, the game master has to get these two things together. Then the player has to determine momentum and if they're going to do threat, and they have to figure out which focus they're going to use, right? And there is a calculation, there is a lot of calculation on every single difficulty check. Now, when everybody has this mastered, it's beautiful, right? And it works great. But it is like dragging people over glass to understand this, right? And I will say right now, this is a huge problem we have in Dungeons and Dragons, and this problem has been inherited in the 2D20 Modiphius system, which is we don't have any concept in the D&D world who's smart and who's a genius, because that's all we have. Oh, and then who's of regular intelligence, right? Not smart, not a genius, just a regular intelligence person, right? And this would be brutally uncomfortable for a regular intelligence person, not someone who's, not somebody who is unintelligent. This is just someone who is of regular intelligence, right? And we have extremely few people like this in Dungeons and Dragons. The ante to play Dungeons and Dragons is 1,000 pages, and it's worse. It's worse with Modiphius, right? Modiphius has, they got to have, 40, 50 different books, right? Like, there's a ton of books, right? And so we do not get, regular intelligence people up in the D&D world. And so if you started playing this and you just brought a regular intelligence person, everybody at the table is smart and geniuses, because they're all used to Dungeons and Dragons. And that's not me saying it. It literally says it in the book. They're like, we know you didn't roll up here to play Star Trek, right? You've already been through D&D. It says it right in the book. It says you've already played other TTRPGs. They're talking about D&D. Like, nobody comes into TTRPGs through any other way. Like, at the macro level, I would say it's maybe 1% to 3%, right? Just like, it's very much not, right? So it really is pretty wild. And the reality is, it's extremely complicated. And so what this means is, it's extremely complicated. Now, if everybody at the table is smart and a genius and selfish, you're set, right? So what do I mean by selfish? Well, a lot of people don't care. There's a ton of people who are like, oh, I don't want to play with, people who are not smart or intelligent, right? Or smart or geniuses. That's repugnant. It's super prejudiced toward regular intelligence people. And so I have to say, man, this thing, like the 2D20 Modiphius Star Trek Adventures game, is a beautiful tabletop role-playing game if everyone at the table is smart to genius, right? Now, I think I'm right on the borderline. I tip into genius on some days, but I'm always smart, right? And so, so those are the things that are worse. Those are the things that are really worse about the difficulty check. And so now I've told you the good and I've told you the bad. So which one is better? Dungeons and Dragons, because it's less prejudice. Okay. I actually think Modiphius's 2D20 is literally prejudiced toward regular smart people. And the reason why is, and I play board games. I own 50 board games, right? And I cannot tell you, I've learned this lesson the hard way, right? It gets really bad when you're like, oh, this is simple. No, it is not. You are used to only talking to smart, genius people. And there is a prejudice of it, right? And 2D20 Modiphius is crunchy, way crunchy, right? And so at the end of the day, if everybody at the table is smart and geniuses, I would say that you actually have a better rule system for the difficulty check on the Modiphius side. But if you're not selfish and you care about regular intelligence people and you want tabletop role-playing experience to grow, then it's worse. It's worse, right? So if you're a selfish person, it's better. Like Modiphius 2d20 is better. If you are not a selfish, prejudiced person, Dungeons and Dragons remains the best, because Dungeons and Dragons doesn't leave people behind. They continue to make their game so it is accessible to regular intelligence people. I'm not talking about unintelligent people. I'm talking regular intelligence, and that is a grouping. It is a real grouping, right? And so that is my take on the difference between the Modiphius 2d20 difficulty check and the Dungeons and Dragons difficulty check. I did want to say one other thing. Just, playing Star Trek Adventures, I kept saying Modiphius is some European company. Their headquarters are in London. Okay, so Modiphius is a British company, to my knowledge. If anybody knows different, so I'm taking that to say that's a British company, right? If anybody knows different, let me know. Thank you very much for letting me share my opinion on this with you. Every single word you just heard was my humble opinion. Nothing more, nothing less. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.